She was publicly humiliated in front of the entire ICU staff for refusing to give up on a paralyzed Navy SEAL that every specialist had already written off as brain dead. Then the dying soldier opened his cracked lips and whispered a classified military call sign that had never appeared in any medical file, any public record, or any database accessible to a civilian nurse. And the word came out broken, barely audible, but she heard it. She answered him without thinking. The room went so quiet you could hear the oxygen monitors blinking, and the neurologist who had spent the last 10 minutes mocking her in front of everyone suddenly stopped smiling. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because this channel is where the stories nobody talks about finally get told. Stories about the people who get pushed to the floor and still find a way to stand back up. If this one moves you, and I promise it will, tap the like button and drop a comment telling me what city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The overnight shift at Hargrove General Hospital started the way most overnight shifts did in the neurology wing, with the low mechanical hum of ventilators, the occasional soft ping of a heart monitor, and the particular brand of institutional silence that wasn't really silence at all, but just noise you eventually stopped hearing. Lauren Reeves had worked the floor for 6 years. She knew the sound of every machine, the rhythm of every ward, the exact pitch a monitor reached before it tipped from warning into alarm. She knew which patients needed an extra blanket and which ones couldn't sleep with the overhead lights left at any setting above 40%. She knew how to read a chart in the time it took most residents to find their stethoscopes. What she didn't know, what nobody had told her when she transferred into Hargrove's Neurology Critical Care Unit 14 months ago, was that there were people in this building who had already decided she was too quiet to matter. It hadn't taken long to figure that out on her own. She was 34 years old and she looked younger, which worked against her. She kept her brown hair pulled back in a tight braid during shifts and wore the standard-issue navy scrubs that every floor nurse wore. No distinction, no flair. She didn't push back in team meetings. She didn't argue in hallways. When attending physicians made calls she privately questioned, she documented everything carefully and kept her mouth shut unless a patient's life was in immediate danger. That restraint had taken years to develop. It had cost her something to build it. What nobody in this hospital knew, what she had not told a single person since she took the position, was why it had cost her. Room 14 had come in on a Tuesday. The paramedics had brought him through the ER bay at 2:47 a.m. with a trauma designation that usually meant the receiving team was already bracing themselves. Blunt force spinal trauma, suspected cervical compression, unresponsive at the scene. The man in the gurney was broad-shouldered in a way that spoke to years of specific physical conditioning, not just gym routine. Mid-30s. No identification. The only item found on him was a cheap waterproof watch, with a small scratch on the face that had been repaired badly with a piece of clear electrical tape. He was admitted as a John Doe while military liaisons worked to identify him. Within 18 hours, the hospital had a name: Sergeant First Class Daniel Morrow, United States Navy. A liaison officer arrived, spoke briefly with hospital administration, and the patient was moved from the general trauma ward to a private ICU room with a security log on the door. The liaison did not stay. Lauren had not been assigned to room 14 initially. She picked up the patient when Marcus Webb, the night shift nurse who normally covered that corridor, called in sick on Thursday. She walked in for the first time at the start of her shift, reviewed the chart hanging at the foot of the bed, and stood at the threshold for a moment, taking in the room before she crossed into it. The man in the bed hadn't moved in 4 days. The ventilator was breathing for him. His eyes were closed. The monitoring equipment showed brain activity that 2 separate attending neurologists had already characterized as minimal. One of them had used the word vegetative in a documented note, though the other had been more cautious and written inconclusive pending further assessment. Lauren read both notes. She read them twice. Then she pulled a chair to the bedside and started doing what she always did when she wasn't sure about something. She watched. She wasn't looking for anything dramatic. She wasn't expecting revelation. She was just looking the way she had trained herself to look. Not at the obvious data, but at the spaces between it. His breathing. the microtension in his jaw, the way his hands sat at his sides, fingers slightly curled, which was natural for a relaxed unconscious patient, except that the curl on the right hand was fractionally tighter than the one on the left. Not seizure activity, not reflexive spasm, just a small and consistent difference that the documentation had not mentioned anywhere. She noted it in her own pad and kept watching. At 4:15 a.m., Dr. Raymond Ashby walked into the room. He was the senior attending neurologist on the case, board-certified, Harvard-trained, the kind of physician who had plaques in his office that faced outward so patients could see them when they sat down. He was also the kind of physician who walked into a room and immediately began talking at whatever staff member was present, rather than to them. Night shift. He said it like a category, not a greeting. Anything change? His right-hand grip tension has been consistently higher than his left since I came on at 11, Lauren said. It's small, but it's been stable for the last 5 hours. Might be worth... That's a resting reflex variance. He didn't look at her. He was reviewing the tablet in his hand, scrolling through scan results. It's been documented. It's not significant. I didn't see it in the chart. He looked up then. Looked at her the way people looked at things that had become mildly inconvenient. I'm sorry, are you the attending neurologist on this case? She didn't answer that. He didn't seem to expect her to. He finished his review, made one notation on the digital chart, and left. The visit had taken 4 minutes. Lauren sat with it for a while after he was gone. Then she went back to watching the patient. But by Friday morning, 2 things had changed. The first was that Sergeant Morrow had been formally assigned to Dr. Preston Vance, the hospital's chief of neurology and the attending who had written the word vegetative in the chart. Dr. Vance was 61, well regarded in the field, and carried himself with the particular authority of someone who had been the smartest person in most rooms for a very long time. He had a reputation for being decisive. In neurology, decisive sometimes meant right and sometimes meant early. And the difference between those 2 things was everything. The second thing that changed was that Lauren noticed the blinking. It happened at 6:20 a.m., when the early light was just starting to press through the privacy blinds on the window. She had been in the room for over an hour, charting quietly, when she looked up and saw it. Sergeant Morrow's right eye, not both eyes, just the right, moved in a pattern that was too deliberate to be muscle flutter. 3 short movements. A pause. 2 longer ones. A pause. 3 short again. She set down her chart. She watched it happen twice more before she was willing to trust what she was seeing. 3 short, 2 long. 3 short. She had learned that pattern in a context that had nothing to do with nursing school. She had learned it a long time ago, in a world she had left behind and rarely talked about, in conditions that bore no resemblance to this clean, fluorescent-lit hospital room. But her body remembered it before her brain caught up. SOS. He was signaling. Trapped inside a body that had stopped responding to conscious command, he was signaling with the one muscle he still had partial control over. He was not in a vegetative state. He was completely aware, completely conscious. And he had been watching and waiting and signaling for however long it had been since the light patterns in this room gave him enough contrast to try. Lauren stood up slowly. She crossed to the bedside. She leaned down so she was at eye level with him, close enough that if he had any peripheral awareness, he could see her face. She spoke quietly. I see you. The right eye stopped moving, then it blinked once, firmly, and stopped. She understood that too. I'm going to get you help, she said. But I need you to stay calm. Can you do that? One blink. She straightened up and went directly to the nurse's station to page Dr. Ashby, because Dr. Vance hadn't arrived yet and she needed someone in that room immediately. She told the page operator it was urgent. She was told Dr. Ashby was in a department briefing. She said it could not wait. She was asked to document her concerns in the patient's file, and a physician would review when available. Lauren documented her concerns in the file. Then she went back to room 14 and she sat with Sergeant Morrow and talked to him quietly about nothing in particular. Weather, the hospital's terrible vending machine selection, the fact that the blinds in this room had a broken slat on the left side that nobody had fixed for 3 weeks. And she watched his right eye and he listened, and that was the hour that broke something open in the wall she had spent years building around what she used to be. Dr. Preston Vance arrived at 8 a.m. sharp. He was followed by 2 residents and a medical student, which meant it was going to be a teaching case, which meant Lauren needed to be precise and quick and not leave room for condescension. She was waiting at the door of room 14. Dr. Vance, so she kept her voice steady. I need to report a significant observation about the patient in this room before you do rounds. He stopped. He looked at her name badge. Nurse Reeves. Yes. I've been with this patient since 11 p.m. At approximately 6:20 this morning, I observed a deliberate and patterned response in his right eye. He's signaling. He has awareness. One of the residents, young, eager, clearly not yet trained in the art of keeping his expression neutral, looked at the patient's chart on his tablet with slightly widened eyes. The other resident kept her face carefully blank. The medical student stared at Lauren. Dr. Vance did not look at any of them. He looked at Lauren with an expression that was not unkind, but was absolutely definitive. The patient's last full neurological assessment was completed yesterday by 2 board-certified neurologists, he said. The consensus finding was minimal brain activity inconsistent with conscious awareness. What you observed was most likely involuntary ocular muscle response. It's common in patients on this ventilator protocol. It was patterned, Lauren said, specifically a 3-2-3 pattern consistent with Nurse Reeves. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. I appreciate your diligence. Document the observation, and I'll have someone review the scan data later today. Now, if you'll excuse me. He walked into the room. The residents followed. The medical student shot Lauren a quick, unreadable look before he went through the door. Lauren stood in the hallway and made herself breathe. She documented the observation with exact timestamps. She flagged it as urgent. She sent a message to the charge nurse requesting that Dr. Vance be formally notified of her concerns in writing. She did everything she was supposed to do. And then she went back to her other patients because she was a professional, and she knew how this worked, and she knew that sometimes being right and being believed were 2 completely different things. The crisis came at 11:40 a.m., and it came because of a decision that should not have been made. Dr. Vance had ordered a positional adjustment to Sergeant Morrow's cervical alignment, a neck repositioning that, in his assessment, would optimize the patient's airway management. It was a routine adjustment for patients on long-term ventilation. The nurses who carried it out were following protocol exactly as written. Lauren was at the workstation at the end of the hall when the monitor alarm sounded. She was running before she consciously registered the alarm tone, not the standard alert, not the low-urgency ping, but the sustained 3-beat pattern that meant cardiovascular cascade. She hit the door of room 14 and took in the room in a single second. Sergeant Morrow's oxygen saturation dropping on the screen, heart rate spiking in the wrong direction, the nurse who had performed the adjustment standing back with an expression that was 2 steps away from panic. What happened? Lauren was already at the bedside. We repositioned per the order. His pressure dropped immediately. Neutral spine, Lauren said, and her voice came out in a register she hadn't used in a long time. Not loud, not aggressive, clipped and absolute and clear. Get his head back to baseline right now. Airway first. Someone call neurosurgery, not neurology. Call neurosurgery and tell them possible compression event in room 14. Dr. Vance ordered the reposition. I know what he ordered. Reverse it, now. She was already repositioning the patient's head herself, hands placed with a precision that came from muscle memory she hadn't consciously accessed in years. He's got cervical compression that hasn't been identified. This adjustment just made it worse. Get me neurosurgery on the phone and get the rapid response team in here. The nurse at the door hesitated for exactly 1 more second and then moved. The rapid response team arrived in 90 seconds. Lauren gave them a handoff briefing in the time it took them to enter the room, compressed, sequential, no wasted words, and stepped back to let them work while maintaining her position at the head of the bed. The team lead, a senior resident named Dr. Okafor, listened to her with the focused attention of someone who was too busy managing a crisis to have time for skepticism. Cervical compression, he said, hands already moving. Missed injury, probably C4 to C5. The repositioning compromised what was already an unstable alignment. He looked at her once. How sure are you? Enough. He ordered emergency imaging. Bombed. It was during the controlled chaos of the next 20 minutes. Portable scanner equipment being moved in, additional monitoring lines being placed, the quiet but urgent radio chatter of a team working fast. That it happened. The room had a specific kind of noise to it now, layered and purposeful, and Lauren was standing close to the head of the bed, tracking the patient's vitals on the portable monitor when Sergeant Morrow's right hand moved. Not a reflex twitch, a reach. His fingers extended slightly in the direction of her wrist, and she felt the contact. Dry skin, weak grip, absolutely intentional. And she looked down at his face, and his right eye was open. He was looking at her. His lips moved. The ventilator was still breathing for him, and the sound that came out was barely sound at all. Scraped air moving past vocal cords that had almost nothing to push them, just the ghost of a voice. But she heard it. Ghost. The word dissolved immediately, swallowed by the noise of the room, and maybe two other people close enough might have caught it, but they were focused on their own tasks and probably registered it as the unconscious vocalization that sometimes happened during vascular events. Lauren registered it as something else entirely. The word hit her somewhere below her sternum, and she stood very still for a moment with the controlled stillness of someone who had just been handed a live wire and needed a second to decide what to do with it. Ghost was not a word, not in this context. It was a designation. It was the operational call sign used within a specific joint task force structure that had operated in 3 countries over 4 years. A structure that had been classified at a level that meant its operational terminology did not appear in any public military record and would mean absolutely nothing to a civilian. It would mean nothing to a civilian nurse standing in a hospital room in Denfield, Colorado. Lauren Reeves had not been a civilian nurse for her entire adult life. She leaned down. She brought her face close to his because she needed him to hear her, and she needed the words to stay between them, and she spoke quietly enough that the sounds were swallowed by the ambient noise of the room. "Easy, Ranger," she said. "I'm here." The grip on her wrist tightened by a degree that was small but unmistakable. She straightened up and went back to monitoring his vitals, and she did not look at the faces around her, but she felt them. She felt at least 2 of the rapid response team members pause in what they were doing for a fraction of a second too long, the particular hesitation of someone who has registered something they can't immediately explain. She kept her expression flat and professional and did not explain herself. Dr. Preston Vance arrived back in room 14 at approximately 12:20 p.m., by which point the emergency imaging had confirmed what Lauren had said. A significant and dangerous cervical compression at the C4 to C5 junction that had been present since admission and had been missed in every assessment for 4 days. The positional adjustment he had ordered had exacerbated an injury that was already one mechanical stress away from catastrophic. He stood at the edge of the room with the images on a tablet in his hands, and he looked at them for a long moment, and he did not say anything. Lauren did not offer him a way to make this easier. "The compression?" Dr. Okafor said. He was addressing Vance, but he was watching Lauren. "I see it," Vance said. "Neurosurgery is on their way down. Dr. Mitra's team." Vance nodded. His face had gone through something in the last 60 seconds that his professional training was working hard to manage. He set the tablet down on the supply cart beside him and turned to Lauren with an expression that had been carefully reconstructed into something neutral. "Nurse Reeves," he said, "walk me through your clinical reasoning." She did. Concisely, without editorializing, she described the hand grip variants she'd noticed at 4 a.m., the ocular signaling at 6:20, and her assessment that the patient had been conscious and aware since at minimum the previous night. She described the cervical compression sign she had observed during the positional adjustment and her decision to call neurosurgery directly rather than wait for neurology to respond. Vance listened. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Why didn't you escalate more forcefully this morning when I dismissed your observation?" The question was genuine enough that she answered it honestly. "I did what I was able to do within my scope. I documented urgently, I flagged it formally, and I made myself available. When a senior attending makes a clinical determination, my options within protocol are limited." "That's not an answer." "Yes, it is," she said. "It's just not a comfortable one." He held her gaze for a second longer than was comfortable, and then he turned to deal with the incoming surgical team. "Bob, The problem was that Dr. Vance was not the only neurologist who had an interest in what happened in room 14. Dr. Raymond Ashby had been on the floor when the rapid response was called. He had not gone into the room, that wasn't his case, but he had been in the hallway and he had heard enough. When Lauren came out of room 14 at 12:45 to brief the charge nurse, Ashby was standing at the workstation 15 feet away with an expression that had moved past annoyed and landed somewhere harder. "Nurse Reeves," he said her name like a problem he was finally addressing. "What exactly did you say to the patient in there?" She stopped. "I'm sorry?" "Dr. Okafor's resident said you spoke to the patient during the rapid response. You said something to him, and he responded." "The patient had a vocal response. It's in my notes." "That's not what I asked." He took a step toward her, and his voice dropped just enough to stay out of the hallway's general hearing range. "I asked what you said to him. And I'm asking because 2 members of the rapid response team are telling me that whatever you said to him, he answered you. A patient who has been classified as minimally conscious. A patient with a classified military designation." He paused. "So I'll ask again. What did you say?" Lauren looked at him steadily. "I told the patient I was there and that I was going to help him." "And his exact response?" "He vocalized. I documented it." "What did he say, Nurse Reeves?" She held his gaze for exactly as long as it took her to decide that this conversation had already gone further than it should without documentation of its own. "I think you should direct further questions about the patient's clinical status to Dr. Mitra's surgical team," she said. "They're the attending team now." She turned and walked back toward the nurse's station. She heard Ashby say her name once more behind her, hard and flat, and she did not stop. She had barely reached the station when her pager went off. Not the hospital paging system, her personal phone which she kept clipped at her hip. A number she didn't recognize, but an area code she did. A Federal Exchange prefix that she hadn't seen in over a decade. She looked at it. She looked at the door of room 14. And somewhere in the hall behind her, she could hear Dr. Ashby on the phone, his voice low and controlled, saying the words she spoke to him. She knew the response. "I want her removed from this floor." Lauren Reeves stood at the nurse's station in Hargrove General Hospital in Denfield, Colorado, and looked at the number on her phone and thought about all the ways a life could fold in on itself at unexpected moments and force a person back to the shape they'd been before they had the chance to become something quieter. She put the phone back in her pocket. She picked up the next patient chart. She was still a nurse on shift, and there were people in this building who needed her, and whatever was coming could wait until she was ready for it. She just wasn't sure how long that was going to be. She didn't look at the phone again until her break, which came late because breaks on the neurology floor always came late, and by then the number had stopped trying. Whatever it was, whoever it was, they hadn't left a message. That told her something. People who left messages wanted a response. People who didn't leave messages wanted to see what you'd do with the silence. She'd known people like that. She'd worked alongside people like that in conditions where the silence between a transmission and a response could mean someone was alive or wasn't. The memory wasn't distant the way she sometimes managed to keep it. It was close today. Closer than it had been in a long time. She ate half a granola bar from her locker, drank cold coffee standing at the break room counter, and spent 11 minutes doing the kind of nothing that passed for rest on a floor like this. Then she went back out. The hallway outside room 14 was different when she returned to her station. Not dramatically. Nothing in a hospital hallway ever changed dramatically unless something was already going wrong, but in the small ways that Lauren had trained herself to read over years of working in places where the small ways mattered. The security log on the door had a new signature. 2 people she didn't recognize were standing near the elevator bank in conversation, and they were wearing the particular brand of business casual that wasn't actually casual at all, the kind that came from people who worked in buildings with security clearance requirements and had simply removed their lanyards. One of them was on a phone. The other one was watching the hallway with a specific quality of attention that Lauren associated with people who had been trained to watch hallways. She noted it. She kept moving. She picked up the chart for the patient in room 12 and started her afternoon review. At 2:15 p.m., the charge nurse, Patricia Holloway, found Lauren at the station. Patricia was 53 and had worked Hargrove General, longer than most of the attending physicians had been licensed. She was a straight-line person, not unkind, not inflexible, but clear about how things worked and generally accurate about why. She set both hands flat on the counter and looked at Lauren the way she looked at things she didn't particularly want to deal with, but was going to deal with anyway. "Ashby wants you off the floor," she said. "He's filed a complaint with administration. Insubordination during the rapid response and inappropriate patient contact. That's the language he used." Lauren set down the chart. "He filed it already." "Within the hour. Dr. Vance hasn't weighed in yet, which is either good or complicated. I'm not sure which." Patricia paused. "Lauren, the thing you said to the patient, in room 14, 2 of Okafor's team are saying the patient responded to you, not just vocalized, responded. I documented it. I read what you documented. I'm asking about what you didn't." Patricia kept her voice low. "Not conspiratorial, practical. I've worked with you for 14 months. I know the difference between a nurse who makes a lucky clinical call and a nurse who's working from something else. I'm not asking to report you. I'm asking because in about 40 minutes, there's going to be someone from hospital administration in the nursing director's office with Ashby's complaint, and I want to know how much ground I'm standing on when I go in there with you." Lauren looked at her for a moment. Patricia was giving her something. The least she could do was meet it honestly. "The patient vocalized a specific word," Lauren said. "It was a word that I recognized from a previous context, not a medical context. I responded to it because I assessed that he was conscious and trying to communicate, and responding was the right clinical decision in the moment. And the previous context isn't something I can go into right now." Patricia held her gaze. "Is it something that's going to walk through my ward in the next 24 hours and make my life complicated?" Lauren thought about the 2 people near the elevator. "Possibly." "Okay." Patricia straightened up. "Then here's what I can do. I can go into that meeting and make the case that your clinical decisions during the rapid response were sound, which they were, because Dr. Mitra's team found exactly what you said they'd find, and the patient's alive right now partly because of your intervention. I can make that case on the record. What I cannot do is protect you from a formal complaint that has Dr. Ashby's name on it, because he has more authority in this building than you do, and that's just how it is." She picked up her clipboard. "Meeting's at 3. I'd clean up your documentation between now and then if there's anything you want to make sure is airtight." "It's airtight," Lauren said. "Good." Patricia moved to leave, then stopped. "For what it's worth, the patient's wife called. She's driving in from out of state. She'll be here this evening. Someone's going to have to talk to her about what her husband's actual condition is, which means someone's going to have to untell her what 2 neurologists told her 4 days ago." She didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. Lauren went back to her documentation. The meeting at 3 went the way she'd expected it to go, which was badly, but in the specific and organized way that institutional processes went badly when the decision had already been made before anyone sat down. The nursing director was a woman named Sandra Felk, who was careful and measured and clearly uncomfortable, which meant she had been given a directive before Lauren and Patricia walked into the room. Dr. Ashby was there. A man from the hospital's administrative team named Garrett Locke was there, and he was the one who did most of the talking, which told Lauren everything about where the complaint had originated and where it was going to land. The language was professional. The language was always professional in rooms like this. Words like protocol deviation and scope of practice concerns and patient relationship boundaries that each meant something precise in a legal and institutional sense and collectively meant, "We want you to go away, and we found the right words to make it happen correctly." Lauren answered every question directly. She provided documentation. She did not apologize for anything she had done, and she did not explain herself in more detail than the question required. Patricia stated clearly that Lauren's clinical intervention had contributed to the identification of a missed injury and that the surgical team had confirmed the assessment. Garrett Locke acknowledged this and then moved immediately to the documented complaint, which he said was separate from the clinical outcome question and needed to be addressed on its own terms. At the end of 40 minutes, Sandra Felk told Lauren that she was being placed on administrative suspension pending review. She was to surrender her access badge and leave the floor by 4:30 p.m. Lauren looked at her. The patient in room 14 is going into surgery tomorrow morning. There are aspects of his neurological presentation that I've documented, but that need verbal handoff to whoever's managing his pre-op monitoring tonight. That will be handled by the attending team, Locke said. The attending team missed a C4 to C5 compression for 4 days. The room got very quiet. Nurse Reeves, Sandra Felk said, and her voice had taken on the careful tone of someone stepping around something they didn't want to name. I understand you feel strongly about this case. The review process will consider your concerns. In the meantime, the suspension is effective immediately. Lauren stood up. She looked at Ashby, who had not said more than 12 words during the entire meeting and was looking at a spot approximately 3 inches to the left of her face. She looked at Locke, who was reviewing something on his phone. She looked at Patricia, who met her eyes with an expression that was honest about its own helplessness. "Okay," Lauren said. She picked up her documentation folder and walked out. She made the verbal handoff anyway. She was technically no longer on active duty in the building, but she found Dr. Okafor in the hallway outside the neurology wing and gave him everything in 5 minutes. The remaining cervical instability markers, the sedation timing she'd noticed in the medication log that didn't quite line up with standard protocol, the specific positional sequence that seemed to correspond with Sergeant Morrow's responsive periods. Okafor listened with his arms crossed and his head slightly tilted forward, the posture of someone taking in information faster than they were showing. "You got suspended," he said when she finished, "half an hour ago. For the rapid response intervention. Officially for scope of practice and insubordination, actually because Ashby doesn't want anyone looking closely at 4 days of missed findings and asking who signed off on them." Okafor looked down the hallway. He was quiet for a moment. "The sedation timing you mentioned, is that documented?" "In my notes, which are now part of the formal review file, so they're hospital property, and I can't hand them to you directly, but you can request them through the surgical team's case review process." She paused. "If you do that today, before anyone has a chance to—" "I understand what you're saying." He met her eyes. "I'll request them." She nodded. She turned to leave. "Nurse Reeves." She stopped. He was looking at her with an expression that was specifically not asking the question she knew he was holding. "Whatever's in your background, whatever made you able to read this patient the way you did. I don't need to know what it is." He paused. "But it saved his life today. I want you to know that I know that." She held that for a second. Let it sit. It didn't fix anything. It wasn't supposed to. "He's not saved yet," she said. "Get him through surgery first." She walked out of the neurology wing with her jacket over her arm and her badge in her pocket and the specific kind of emptiness that came from doing the right thing and watching it cost you anyway. The hospital's main exit was on the ground floor off the central atrium, a large airy space that the administration had decorated with local art prints and a small indoor planting arrangement that Lauren had never once seen a patient stop to look at. She was crossing the atrium when she heard her name from behind her. Not her professional name, not Nurse Reeves. Her first name, said by someone who put a very slight emphasis on the second syllable in a way that was an old habit she'd never heard from anyone at this hospital. She stopped. She turned around slowly. The 2 people she'd seen near the elevator earlier were standing 15 feet behind her. The one who had spoken was a woman. Late 40s, dark hair cut practically short, wearing a charcoal jacket over a white shirt, and carrying a tablet in a way that looked natural but was calculated. The posture was the thing. The posture was unmistakable to anyone who had spent years around people who carried it. "Ms. Reeves," the woman said again, slightly quieter. "We'd like a few minutes." Lauren looked at her, at the man beside her, at the controlled neutrality of their expressions, which were not the controlled neutrality of hospital administrators or insurance representatives. It was a different kind of controlled, practiced in different conditions. "You called earlier," Lauren said, "and didn't leave a message. We wanted to see how you'd respond to the silence." The woman's expression didn't shift. "You didn't call back, which was the right call." "I was working." "You were watching," the woman said. "Same thing for you, probably." Lauren considered them for a moment. The atrium had a handful of other people in it, a family group near the main desk, a volunteer pushing a cart, two nurses she didn't recognize heading toward the elevator. None of them were paying attention to this corner of the room. "This isn't the right place," she said. "No," the woman agreed. "There's a coffee place 2 blocks north. We'll get there ahead of you." They walked out without another word. Lauren stood in the atrium for 30 seconds, looking at the door. Then she looked at the art print on the wall nearest her, a landscape, mountains, the kind of generic beauty that ended up in institutional spaces, and she thought about what it meant that two people with federal clearance profiles had been at this hospital before her suspension meeting and hadn't walked in through the official channels. She picked up her bag. She went through the main doors. She turned north. The coffee place was called Mercer's, and it was the kind of small neighborhood spot that had survived a decade of chain competition by being slightly better than convenient. The woman and the man were already at a corner table when Lauren came in, 2 cups in front of them, a third waiting across the table. Lauren sat down. She didn't touch the coffee. "How long has he been here?" she asked. The woman, she hadn't given a name and Lauren hadn't asked, exchanged a brief look with the man before answering. "He was admitted Tuesday morning. We knew within 6 hours. It took us until today to get authorization to make direct contact with anyone at the facility." "Authorization from who?" "Above my pay grade," the woman said, which was an answer that in Lauren's experience meant the answer existed but wasn't being shared yet. What matters right now is that the patient in that room is not just a missing service member. He was active on an operation when he went down. We don't have full clarity on what happened or how he ended up as a trauma admission through your county ER. Lauren turned her coffee cup without drinking it. "You think it wasn't an accident?" "We don't think anything yet. We're establishing facts." The woman leaned forward slightly. "What matters to us right now, what we came here to establish, is the nature of your interaction with him this morning, specifically the terminology that was used. It's documented in my patient notes. Your patient notes describe a verbal patient response. They don't describe what prompted it." Lauren looked at her steadily. "I don't have an active clearance." "No," the woman agreed. "You don't. You separated 8 years ago, and nothing you did in service has been reinstated." She paused. "That's not why we're here. We're not here to pull you back in. We're here because a man who has been in a classified operational status for the last 14 months just responded to a call sign that is not in any unclassified record to a nurse who should not know it exists." The woman's voice was even. "So we need to understand the nature of that connection." Lauren was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a delivery truck was backing up with the familiar mechanical beeping that was somehow the most ordinary sound in the world, and she sat with it for a second the way she sometimes sat with ordinary sounds when she needed to locate herself. "We were on the same FOB in the second rotation," she said finally. 2011. "I was a combat rescue medic attached to a joint unit. He was part of an element that operated on the same compound for about 4 months. We weren't in the same chain of command. We shared 3 extractions." She paused. The call signs were unit-specific, internal designations that didn't go up the formal reporting chain. The fact that he used one means he recognized me and was trying to establish whether I was trustworthy before he risked communicating more. The man, who had not spoken until now, said, "Why would he need to establish that? In a hospital?" "Because someone has been sedating him on a schedule that doesn't match any documented medical order," Lauren said, "and he's been conscious enough to notice." The silence that followed was the specific kind that happened when a piece of information landed in a place where it immediately shifted the geometry of everything around it. The woman set down her cup. "Say that again." "The medication log has entries that don't align with the prescribing record. I noticed the timing this morning. The sedative doses correspond with the gaps in his responsive periods. He's been more alert in the early mornings, between 2 and 7 a.m., which is outside the window when those shifts usually run their medication rounds." She looked at them both. "Someone has been keeping him under deliberately, not as part of his treatment protocol, separately." The man pulled out a phone. "I flagged it in my notes," Lauren said, "which are now under administrative review because I was suspended 40 minutes ago. Dr. Okafor knows about it. He's requesting access through the surgical review process. But if someone in this hospital has enough authority to manage that medication log, they might also have enough authority to manage what happens to a review request before it gets approved. The woman was already on her own phone. Lauren finally picked up the coffee. It was lukewarm. She drank it anyway because she hadn't eaten a real meal since this morning, and her hands were doing something small and involuntary that she wanted to stop. "We need to move faster than we planned," the woman said, more to her colleague than to Lauren. "Yes," he said. He was already typing. Lauren set down the cup. "What was his operation?" The woman looked at her. I'm not asking for classification details. I'm asking whether what he was doing is connected to why someone in my hospital has been keeping him sedated, because if it is, that changes the surgical risk profile tomorrow morning, and someone needs to know before they open him up." She held the woman's gaze. "He trusted me with one word. I need enough to protect him." A long pause. "There was a procurement irregularity," the woman said carefully, "related to a rehabilitation technology contract, DoD funded, the kind of contract where the wrong people having early access to the data would be worth a significant amount of money to the right buyer." She stopped there. "That's as far as I go." Lauren absorbed it, sat with it, let the shape of it settle into what she already knew about the sedation timing and the missed injury and the neurologist who had filed a complaint within an hour of her identifying what he had failed to find. "Dr. Ashby," she said quietly. Not a question. Neither of them confirmed it. Neither of them denied it. "He's on the surgical pre-op team," Lauren said. "Vance is lead, but Ashby is the consulting neurologist, and he's scheduled to be present tomorrow morning." The woman stood up. "We're going to make some calls." "I'm suspended," Lauren said. "I can't go back in that building." "You won't need to." The woman picked up her jacket from the back of the chair. "Go home. Stay reachable. Don't call anyone at that hospital." "And the patient?" "We're going to have eyes on him in the next hour." Lauren stood. She looked at the woman for a moment, at the careful, practiced face and the specific kind of tiredness behind the eyes that came from years of working in spaces where the cost of a mistake was measured in bodies. "He remembered the call sign," Lauren said. "He's been in that room for 4 days, he's been sedated, he's been in pain, he couldn't communicate, and the first thing he did when he found someone he recognized was give them the identifier that meant, 'I'm still here and I'm still thinking.'" She picked up her bag. "Don't let them put Ashby in that OR." She walked out without waiting for a response. The October air outside Mercer's was cold, in the way mountain-adjacent towns got cold in the late afternoon, fast and serious. The kind of cold that reminded you winter wasn't coming. It was already there at the edges. Lauren walked the 2 blocks back to the hospital parking structure and found her car and sat in it for 4 minutes without starting the engine. The unknown number called again. She looked at it. This time she picked up. "Reeves," she said. The voice on the other end was male, older, carrying the particular cadence of someone who had given briefings in loud environments for most of their professional life and had learned to be clear above everything else. "Staff Sergeant Reeves," he said. "This is Commander Walsh, Naval Special Warfare. I'm going to need you to stay exactly where you are." Lauren's hand tightened on the phone. "We have a problem with your hospital," he said, "and you're the only person currently in that city who can tell us how bad it is." Outside the parking structure, the sky over Denfield had gone the flat, gray-purple of late afternoon in October, and the first lights of the hospital building were coming on in the windows above her, yellow and steady. The building continuing its ordinary work while something that was not ordinary at all moved through its corridors. And Lauren Reeves sat in her car in the dark of the parking structure and understood that the quiet life she had built in this city had just run out of runway. "Commander Walsh," Lauren said, "how did you get this number?" "Same way we found you," he said. "You're good at disappearing, Staff Sergeant. Not good enough." She didn't ask how long they'd known where she was. That question didn't matter right now, and Walsh didn't sound like the kind of man who answered questions that didn't matter. "Tell me about the problem," she said. "What do you know about a company called Verispon Neurotech?" She didn't know the name, she said so. DoD contractor. Rehabilitation technology. Spinal cord injury recovery systems. Next-generation neural interface for paralysis reversal. They've been in a competitive bid process for a federal contract worth approximately $400 million. The evaluation window closes in 11 days. He paused, and she heard paper moving on his end, or something like paper. Sergeant Morrow was part of a small investigative element looking into whether someone inside the bid process had been given access to the competing contractor's proprietary data. He was getting close to something when he went dark and ended up in my ER, with injuries consistent with a fall from a significant height. Except that Sergeant Morrow has been jumping out of things for 15 years and has never once landed wrong. Walsh's voice was even. We don't call it anything officially yet, but we're not calling it an accident either. Lauren looked through the windshield at the concrete wall of the parking structure. Someone had scratched something into the paint at eye level. Initials, a date, the kind of small human mark people left in places when they wanted to prove they'd been somewhere. Verispan, she said, is that connected to the hospital? Hargrove General has a research partnership with Verispan Neurotech, joint study on spinal compression rehabilitation outcomes. It's been running for about 18 months. He paused. The study's primary clinical investigator is a Dr. Raymond Ashby. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. He's been classifying patients, she said, not treating them, enrolling them. That's our working theory. A patient classified as permanently paralyzed is a very different data point for a rehabilitation study than a patient who recovers. The value of the outcomes data depends significantly on the baseline classification. He stopped. Sergeant Morrow, if correctly identified as conscious and recovering, breaks the statistical foundation of Ashby's last 14 months of research, which breaks Verispan's bid submission, which costs someone an enormous amount of money. So keeping him sedated and classified as vegetative keeps the data intact, keeps the contract viable. And if Morrow eventually deteriorates or is transferred to long-term care without recovering, there's no record that he was ever anything other than what Ashby said he was. Lauren opened her eyes. Surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning. If the spinal compression is relieved correctly, he could start showing meaningful recovery within days. There's no way to hide that. No, Walsh said, which means tonight is the window. She understood immediately what he meant and felt something cold move through her that wasn't quite fear. She'd stopped having the fear response in the clean way a long time ago, but was in the same neighborhood. I need to go back in, she said. You're suspended. I'm aware. Local law enforcement and federal agents are being coordinated as we speak. We expect to have people on the ground at Hargrove within... He paused and she heard a muffled exchange on his end. 2 to 3 hours. Possibly longer depending on authorization. That's too long. Staff Sergeant, 2 to 3 hours is his entire overnight window, Lauren said, and her voice was flat and precise and not raised at all. If Ashby decides tonight is his last clean opportunity to manage this, 2 to 3 hours is more than enough time to administer something that looks like a natural deterioration event in a patient who's already been classified as neurologically compromised. And my documentation, the medication timing irregularities, is sitting in a review file that Ashby has enough institutional access to touch. She stopped. You need someone in that building now. I'm the only person you've got who already knows the floor, already knows the patient, and already knows what to look for. Walsh was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she listened to the ambient sound on his end and tried to read it. Indoor, multiple voices in the background. The particular acoustic signature of a room with a lot of people doing things quickly. You don't have authority to be in that building, he said. I know. If you're caught re-entering under suspension, it becomes a legal problem. I know that too. Another pause. What I'm about to say is not an instruction, and it is not authorization. Are we clear? Clear. If a civilian with relevant medical expertise were to observe what she believed to be an imminent threat to a patient's safety, the duty to act provisions under Colorado Medical Code do not expire with an employment suspension. They expire with a license. Yours is current. She was already reaching for her access badge before she remembered she'd surrendered it. She stopped, thought for 2 seconds. I need another way in, she said. The service entrance on the building's east side uses a rotating staff code, Walsh said. As of this shift change, it's 7419. She didn't ask how he had it. She was already getting out of the car. Well, chit, The east service entrance was used primarily by maintenance and supply staff and opened into a corridor that ran behind the radiology department on the ground floor. At 6:20 p.m., it was quiet enough that Lauren moved through it without encountering anyone until she reached the stairwell door, where a housekeeping worker with a cart gave her a glance and then looked away in the manner of someone who was paid to clean things, not monitor them. She took the stairs to the third floor. The neurology wing at this hour was in the particular rhythm of early evening, dinner trays going out, shift change still 40 minutes away, the attending coverage thin in the way it always was in the gap between day team and night team. Lauren had worked this floor long enough to know that the gap was where things got missed. It was where they had been getting missed for 4 days. She went to the medication room first. It was unlocked, which it shouldn't have been, but she had noticed 3 weeks ago that the lock mechanism on the medication room door had a lag on the self-close function and had mentioned it to the charge nurse on duty at the time, who had put in a maintenance request that had apparently not been fulfilled. Small failures built on small failures. She went to the override log, the physical paper backup that ran parallel to the electronic medication system, and pulled the entries for room 14. The electronic record was the one Okafor had been going to request. The paper log was the one that nobody thought about, the one that got reviewed quarterly and lived in a binder and was largely considered redundant. She found what she was looking for in 4 minutes. There were 6 entries in the past 4 days where a sedative had been drawn and signed out for room 14 that did not appear in the patient's formal medication administration record. The handwriting on 5 of them was the same, slightly forward-leaning, the particular way of someone who had written in the same hand for decades. She had seen that handwriting on consultation notes and chart editions for 14 months. She photographed every page with her phone. Then she went to room 14. The room was dim, the way it always was at this hour, overhead lights off, the equipment providing its own low blue and green glow against the walls. Sergeant Morrow was in the same position, the ventilator maintaining its rhythm, the monitors showing the numbers she had memorized over the last 18 hours. She crossed to the bedside. She leaned down. "It's Spectre," she said quietly, using the second call sign, her own operational designation, the one nobody outside the unit had known, the one he had not yet said but might have been building toward before the room got too crowded to risk it. For 3 seconds, nothing. Then his right eye opened. It moved to her face. It stayed. She exhaled slowly. "I know what's been happening to you. I have documentation. There are people coming who are going to end it." She paused. "I need you to hold on a little longer. Can you tell me if anyone has been in here tonight?" She watched his right eye. 2 slow blinks. A pause. 1 more. She worked it out. She'd learned his rhythm over 18 hours. 2 blinks meant yes. 1 meant no. 3 meant something she was still figuring out. 2 blinks, pause, 1 blink. Yes and no. Someone had been in and something was incomplete. A partial event. Someone started something and didn't finish it. "Someone came in and then left," she said. "Recently." 2 blinks. Fast this time. She straightened up and went to his IV line, checked every connection point, every port, every running solution against what was documented on the board at the foot of the bed. She moved methodically, the way she'd been trained to move when time mattered. Not rushing, because rushing made you miss things, but not stopping either. She found it in the secondary port, a prepared syringe, capped, inserted into the secondary IV access port, but not yet depressed. Loaded and waiting, like a thing set in place to be returned to. She stood very still for a moment. Then she carefully removed the syringe, capped it, wrapped it in a clean glove from the box on the supply cart, and put it in her jacket pocket. Someone had been here, had set this up, and had been interrupted, or had left to retrieve something, or had been called away. They were coming back. She looked at the door. She looked at Sergeant Morrow. She pulled the chair to a position that was not directly visible from the door's small window panel, and sat down and took out her phone and sent Walsh 3 words and a photo of the syringe she'd taken before removing it. "Found it. Loaded. Room 14. Walsh's response came in 40 seconds. "Do not engage. We are accelerating. ETA 90 minutes. She read it twice. 90 minutes. She looked at the chair she was sitting in and the equipment arranged around her and the small, quiet form of the man in the bed who had trusted her with a word in a room full of people who couldn't understand it. She typed back, "Understood." She didn't move from the chair. 31 minutes passed. She tracked them on her watch. At the 20-minute mark, she heard footsteps in the hallway that paused outside room 14 and did not immediately continue. She stayed still. The footsteps moved on. She gave it another 3 minutes and then crossed to the door and looked through the window panel into the hallway. Dr. Raymond Ashby was standing 40 feet away at the nurse's station, reviewing something on his phone. He was wearing his coat, not his white coat, his actual coat, the one physicians wore when they were leaving. But he was still in the building and he was looking at his phone with the specific focus of someone who had just received information that required adjustment. He looked up, not toward room 14, toward the elevator. Lauren stepped back from the window. She heard the elevator open. She heard voices, more than one, not nursing staff voices, the particular register of people speaking in the careful tones of a conversation being deliberately kept quiet. She heard Ashby's voice among them, and then a door she didn't recognize, and then nothing for a moment. Her phone vibrated. Okafor. I requested the review file an hour ago. Records department is saying it's not in the system. Lauren, what's going on? She typed fast. The medication log discrepancies are in the physical paper backup in the med room. Second binder, room 14 section. Get it now before end of shift and get a copy off the floor. She sent it and immediately got a read receipt. Then she texted Walsh. Ashby is on the floor. He's not alone. Physical evidence in med room may be at risk. Walsh. On it. 60 minutes. 60 minutes. She looked at the patient. She looked at the door. She pulled up the phone's camera, documented the IV port where the syringe had been installed, documented the timestamp, documented the current state of his medication board. She sent all of it to Walsh's number in a single file transfer and then sat back down. The next 14 minutes were the longest 14 minutes she'd spent in a long time, and she'd spent some long ones. She used them to think through the surgical timeline. Dr. Mitra's team was operating at 7 a.m. Pre-op would begin at 5:30. The window in which someone could alter the patient's neurological baseline before surgery, not eliminate him, that would trigger investigation too directly, but worsen the presentation, suppress the indicators Lauren had documented, return him to a state consistent with Ashby's classification, was approximately tonight. Once Mitra opened him up and the compression was relieved under observation, the recovery data would exist. It would be witnessed. It would be impossible to suppress. Tonight was the whole game. The door opened. She was on her feet before the handle finished turning, the chair scraping back, and she had positioned herself between the bed and the door in the instinctive geometry of someone who had spent years putting themselves between things and the people who needed protection from them. It was a nurse she didn't recognize, young, female, wearing Hargrove scrubs, carrying a medication tray. She stopped in the doorway and stared at Lauren with the specific expression of someone who had walked into a situation they hadn't expected. "I'm sorry. Who are you? This room is—" "I'm Lauren Reeves. I'm a nurse on this floor." She kept her voice calm. "What's on that tray?" The nurse looked at her tray. "Evening medications for room 14, doctor. Ashby updated the protocol this afternoon. Which medications?" The nurse looked back at her. She was maybe 26. She looked uncertain in a way that Lauren needed to handle carefully because this young woman was not the problem. She was just the mechanism. Lorazepam and a secondary sedative for overnight management, and a— "Who handed you that tray?" "The charge nurse on this shift. Meredith—" She stopped. "I need to administer these. Dr. Ashby signed the order." "Dr. Ashby is not the attending on this case," Lauren said. "The attending is Dr. Mitra's surgical team as of this afternoon. An order from Dr. Ashby for this patient is not a valid administration order." She was watching the nurse's face carefully. "I need you to hold that tray and not administer anything in this room until you have confirmed the order with Dr. Mitra directly. Not with the charge nurse, not with anyone else on this floor, Dr. Mitra." The nurse was very still. She was doing the math, the woman in the room with no badge, the suspended employee, the instruction that contradicted what she'd been handed. Lauren could see her working it out and could see that she was a conscientious person trying to figure out what conscientious meant in this situation. "I don't know who you are," the nurse said, "and you don't have a badge." "No," Lauren said, "I don't, and I'm asking you to make one phone call before you put anything in that line, because if you do it without making that call and something happens to this patient, you will spend the rest of your career answering questions about tonight." She held the young woman's gaze. "One call, please." 30 seconds of silence. The nurse stepped back into the hallway. She took out her own phone. Lauren exhaled. She stayed at the bedside. She heard the nurse's voice in the hallway, low and careful, asking for Dr. Mitra's service line. That was when the hallway got louder. Not alarmingly. Not the alarm tone loudness of a code. Not the raised voice loudness of an argument. The controlled loud of multiple people arriving somewhere with purpose. The sound of hard-soled shoes on linoleum. The brief exchange of institutional credentials with the nursing station. The particular ambient shift in a space when authority walks into it and everything adjusts. Lauren looked at the window panel of room 14's door. She could see past the young nurse, who had stopped mid-phone call and was looking down the hallway with wide eyes. And she could see the hallway itself, and she could count 5 people, 2 of them in the specific dark plainclothes that she recognized, 2 in uniform, actual naval uniform, not the civilian approximation of it, and 1 more behind them moving faster than the others. She recognized the faster one's gait before she could see his face. Walsh. Commander Walsh was not supposed to be here for another 50 minutes. Behind her, Sergeant Morrow's monitor emitted a soft, single ping. Not an alarm, just the ventilator cycling to the next breath sequence. The most ordinary sound in the world. The sound of a person still alive inside a room where several people had worked very hard to make sure that eventually stopped being the case. Lauren put her hand briefly on the rail of the bed. Not on the patient's hand, just the rail, just the cold metal of it. And then she turned to face the door. The hallway outside had gone very quiet in the way that preceded things that didn't stay quiet. And then she heard from somewhere down the corridor the particular sound of a door opening that should not have been opening, the emergency stairwell, the east side, and a voice she recognized as Ashby's saying something in a tone that was past trying to hold itself together, and another voice cutting him off in a register that left no room at all. And then the floor of the neurology wing of Hargrove General Hospital in Denfield, Colorado, became a place where the ordinary rules about who had authority over what were no longer the rules that applied. The door to room 14 opened. Walsh came through first. He was 50-something, gray at the temples, with the build of someone who had stopped trying to look like a soldier and simply remained one by default. He looked at Lauren. He looked at the patient. He looked at the gloved syringe she was already holding out toward him. "That was in his line," she said. He took it without a word and passed it to the man behind him, who was wearing latex gloves and holding an evidence bag. "Dr. Ashby?" Lauren said. "Being detained in the hallway." Walsh looked at the patient's monitors. Then he looked at Lauren with an expression that was doing several things at once, none of them simple. "You didn't wait." "No," she said. "You could have compromised. He would have been dead before you got here, and you know it." She said it without heat, just fact. The syringe was already in the port. Another 20 minutes and someone was coming back to finish it. Walsh was quiet for a moment. The medication log. "Physical backup, med room, second binder. I sent Okafor to get it." "He got it. It's already been photographed and removed from the building." He looked at her. "You've been busy for someone who was told to stay put." "I heard 90 minutes." "You heard 90 minutes. That was too long." He looked at her for another second, and something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly, because Walsh didn't look like a man who did much softening, but acknowledged. The way you acknowledged a fact when you didn't necessarily like it, but couldn't argue against it. "The surgical team has been contacted," he said. "Mitra's moving the operation to tonight. Emergency pre-op, controlled setting, are people in the building for the duration." He turned to say something to the agent behind him and then turned back. "You're going to need to give a formal statement, tonight, before this gets much further." "I know." And you're going to need to explain a few things that are going to require some creative jurisdictional thinking regarding your clearance status and the specific terminology you used with the patient this morning. I know that too. He nodded once. He looked at Sergeant Morrow, looked for a moment longer than a professional assessment required. He's a good man, Walsh said. It came out quieter than the rest of what he'd said. 14 months. We couldn't find him. Lauren didn't answer that. She looked at Morrow, at the monitors, at the ventilator maintaining its rhythm, at the absolute stillness of a man who had been fighting with the only tool he had left. One eye, one signal, 3 letters in a pattern nobody in this building could have been expected to understand. Nobody except her. The agents in the hallway were moving. She could hear it through the door. Coordinated movement, the specific sound of a space being systematically controlled, and underneath it, somewhere further down the corridor, the sound of Dr. Raymond Ashby's voice asking for a lawyer in a tone that had stopped performing authority and started something rawer and less composed. It wasn't relief she felt, standing in room 14 with the evidence bag gone, and Walsh on his radio and the patient's monitors doing what monitors were supposed to do. It was something that didn't have a clean name. The thing that happened when you'd been running on the stripped-down fuel of pure necessity for long enough that the moment the necessity eased, you felt the hours and the costs and the held breath of all of it at once, not in a wave, not dramatically, just in the specific weight of your own body reminding you that it had been carrying something. She pulled the chair back to the bedside. She sat down. She looked at Sergeant Morrow's right eye. It was open. It was looking at her with the particular quality of attention of someone who had very limited means of expression and was using all of them. "Surgery tonight," she said quietly. "Mitra's team. They're good." She paused. "You're going to need to be patient a little longer." 2 blinks. She almost smiled. Didn't quite. Outside in the hallway, she could hear the hospital's ordinary machinery continuing around the extraordinary thing happening inside it. A dinner tray cart rolling, a distant overhead announcement for a physician she didn't know, the ventilator in the next room doing what ventilators did. The world was not stopping for this. It never did. But then, from somewhere outside beyond the hallway, past the nurses' station and the elevator bank and the series of doors that separated this floor from the outside world, she heard something she hadn't expected. The elevator opened. Multiple sets of footsteps. And then a voice she didn't know, female, slightly breathless from moving fast, saying to someone, "Which room? Which room is he in?" And then a different voice, male, one of the agents saying, "Ma'am, I need to see some identification." And then the female voice again, closer now, harder. "My name is Claire Morrow. That is my husband in there. You are going to move." The door to room 14 swung open. A woman stood in the frame. Early 30s, dark circles under her eyes, a drive-wrinkled jacket, a bag still on her shoulder like she'd come directly from a car. She looked at the room, at Walsh, at the monitoring equipment, at Lauren sitting beside the bed, and her eyes landed on the figure in the bed and everything else in her face disappeared. She crossed the room. Lauren stood and stepped back without being asked, giving the woman the space she needed, and watched Claire Morrow reach her husband's hand and hold it with the careful, desperate grip of someone who had spent days being told to prepare for the worst, and was not prepared, had never been prepared, had driven 700 miles refusing to be prepared. "Danny," she said. Just his name. Just that. And Sergeant Daniel Morrow's right eye moved to his wife's face, and it stayed there, and it blinked twice, slow and deliberate. Walsh had stopped talking on his radio. Nobody in the room said anything for a moment. Then Claire Morrow looked up, at the monitors, at the equipment, at the signs of life that 2 neurologists had spent 4 days telling her didn't exist. And her face did something that Lauren looked away from because it was not hers to witness. From somewhere down the hallway, she heard one of the federal agents say, in a clipped and professional voice, "Dr. Ashby, do not reach for that." And then, "Sir, stop." And then the sound of running feet. Lauren was through the door before she'd made the decision to move. The hallway was 30 feet long, and Ashby had a head start of maybe 4 seconds, which wasn't enough. Lauren had spent 8 years being a hospital nurse, and 8 years before that being something else entirely. And the something else entirely was the thing that came back now without asking permission. The assessment that happened before conscious thought, the reading of a space in motion. Ashby was heading for the east stairwell, the same one she'd come in through. He knew the building the way someone knew a building they'd worked in for 11 years, which meant he knew the stairwell opened to the service corridor, and the service corridor had an exterior door that a keycard could open from the inside, even without the rotating code. He still had his keycard. Nobody had taken it yet. The agent who'd shouted was 15 feet behind him and losing ground because he'd been positioned facing the wrong direction when Ashby moved. A second agent was coming from the elevator bank, but at an angle that was going to miss the stairwell door by 2 seconds. Lauren went through the gap between them. She wasn't faster than a panicked man with a head start, but she was running a shorter line, cutting the angle instead of following the same path. And she hit the stairwell door 3 steps behind him, caught it before it closed, and went through into the concrete echo of the stairwell. Ashby was already on the landing below. He heard her and looked up, and his face did something complicated. Surprise, and then a particular kind of fury that came from being cornered by someone you had spent 3 days trying to eliminate. "Stay back," he said. She kept coming down the stairs at a controlled pace, not running now, measured. "There's nowhere to go, Dr. Ashby," she said. "The exterior door is monitored. There are federal agents coordinating with building security right now. You have no authority to be in this building." He was backing toward the exterior door, hand reaching for his keycard. "You're suspended. You're trespassing. Anything you think you have on me is in a federal evidence bag," she said, along with 6 entries in the physical medication log in your handwriting, along with a loaded syringe from the patient's IV port, along with 14 months of research data that DOD investigators have been building a case around since before Sergeant Morrow was admitted. She stopped on the landing above him. "The syringe alone is attempted murder. The research fraud is federal. Your arrangement with Verispan Neurotech is obstruction of a federal contracting process." She paused. "The key card isn't going to help you." His hand was still on the card. He was breathing hard, sweat at his temples, the specific look of a man who had constructed an architecture of careful decisions over a long time and was watching it come apart in a single evening and couldn't find the piece to grab onto. "You have no idea what you've stumbled into," he said. "I know exactly what I've stumbled into." This was a research protocol, a legitimate study. The outcomes data was built on patients you kept from recovering, Lauren said. "That's not a protocol, that's a crime." The stairwell door above her opened. The first agent came through, followed by the second. Ashby looked up at them and then back at Lauren, and something in his posture shifted in the way things shifted when a person's body acknowledged something their mind was still refusing. He took his hand off the keycard. The agents came down the stairs past her. One of them had handcuffs. The other one was on the radio, low and clipped, saying room numbers and status codes into the receiver. Lauren stepped back and let them work. She stood in the stairwell for a moment after they'd moved Ashby out, in the concrete quiet of it, under the fluorescent strip light that buzzed slightly at one end. Her hands were steady. Her heart rate was coming down from whatever it had spiked to. She was aware of a soreness in her left shoulder from the angle she'd caught the stairwell door, and she was aware that she hadn't eaten since a granola bar at 2 p.m., and she was aware that the stairwell smelled like industrial cleaning products and old concrete, and she held all of those ordinary things alongside the not ordinary thing that had just happened, because that was the only way she knew how to do this. She went back upstairs. Dr. Mitra's surgical team arrived on the floor at 8:45 p.m. There were 6 of them, the attending neurosurgeon, 2 residents, an anesthesiologist, a scrub tech, and a circulating nurse. And they moved with the focused efficiency of a team that had been pulled from other plans and had made the professional decision to not show it. Dr. Mitra was a compact woman in her late 40s with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the specific communicative economy of someone who said things once and expected them to land. She found Lauren in the hallway outside room 14 and stopped. "You're Reeves," she said. "Yes." "Walsh said you found the syringe." "Yes." Mitra looked at her for a moment with the assessment gaze of someone sizing up a source. Walk me through the cervical presentation as you observed it this morning. I have Okafor's notes and the imaging, but I want your clinical read before I go in there. Lauren walked her through it. 4 minutes, no editorializing. The hand grip variance at 4 a.m., the ocular signaling, the timeline of the positional adjustment, and the cardiac response, the specific physical indicators she'd observed during her intervention that morning. Mitra listened with her arms crossed and her head tilted in the way of someone loading information at speed. The C4 to C5 compression was established on the imaging, Mitra said when Lauren finished. The question is stability. What's your read on how much the morning adjustment affected it? His responsive periods increased after I corrected the position. Ocular response improved. That's subjective, but it suggests the compression shifted rather than worsened. He's been neurologically stable since the rapid response intervention. Lauren paused. The bigger risk tonight is whatever was in the syringe. Walsh has it, but we don't have a lab result yet. If it was administered over the last 4 days in smaller doses and this was going to be a larger terminal dose, I've ordered a full tox panel. Pre-op blood draw is happening now. Mitra nodded once. She turned toward room 14 and then stopped again. You got suspended this afternoon. Yes. You came back anyway. Yes. Mitra looked at her with an expression that was not quite approving and not quite disapproving, more like a person filing information in the correct drawer. Don't go far, she said. I may need you to talk to my anesthesiologist about his baseline presentation before the sedation protocol. She went into room 14. Lauren stayed in the hallway. It wasn't permission to be on the floor, and she wasn't going to pretend it was. But the floor was a federal situation now, and the hospital's administrative chain of command was somewhere downstream of that, and nobody had come to escort her out. She found a chair near the nurses' station, and she sat in it, and she watched the organized motion of Mitra's team and the federal agents doing their own parallel work, and the regular floor staff navigating all of it with the pragmatic adaptability of people who worked in hospitals and had learned that unpredictable things happen, and you kept doing your job around them. Patricia Holloway appeared at 9:10. She looked at Lauren in the chair at the nurses' station, and she looked at the federal agents, and she looked at the door of room 14, and she set her jaw in a particular way. Sandra Felk is going to be here in 30 minutes, she said. Okay, Lauren said. She's not happy. That seems right. Patricia sat down in the chair beside her. Garrett Locke called me 20 minutes ago. He wanted to know what the federal presence in the building was about and whether it was connected to the Morrow case. She paused. I told him I didn't have that information, which is technically still true because nobody has briefed me. But I'm standing here and I'm looking at what I'm looking at. What are you looking at? Lauren said. I'm looking at a suspended nurse who came back into a building she was removed from, and I'm looking at federal agents, and I'm looking at Dr. Ashby's empty office. And I'm putting it together the way any person with functioning eyes would put it together. Patricia was quiet for a moment. I should have pushed harder this morning. You did what you could do. That's generous. It's accurate, Lauren said. The institutional structure was working against both of us. You couldn't override Ashby any more than I could. What mattered was that you went into that review meeting and put my clinical record on the table. Patricia looked at her. Is he going to survive? Morrow. Mitra's good. The compression is identifiable and operable. If the tox panel doesn't show something catastrophic in his system, his prognosis is better tonight than it was this morning. Lauren paused. He was conscious and signaling for days. That's neurological function. That's something to work with. Patricia nodded slowly. She didn't say anything else. They sat together in the 2 chairs at the nurses' station while the floor moved around them and the evening deepened outside the windows. Sandra Felk arrived at 9:38 p.m. with Garrett Locke behind her, and the particular expression of someone who had been woken from something to deal with something they did not feel equipped to deal with. She stopped when she saw the federal agents. She stopped again when one of them approached her and asked for identification with the polite immovability of someone who was not going to stop asking. Lauren watched from the nurses' station as Felk went through the process of understanding that the building she administered was currently operating under a different set of rules than the ones she managed. Locke looked worse. He had the look of a man running calculations that kept coming out wrong. Walsh came out of room 14 and intercepted Felk before she could reach the nurse's station. He spoke to her for approximately 4 minutes, in a tone too low to carry, and Lauren watched Felk's face go through several distinct phases during those 4 minutes. Surprise. Disbelief. The specific recalibration that happened when institutional authority encountered something larger than itself and had to rapidly redetermine its own position. When Walsh finished, Felk looked at Lauren. Lauren met her gaze and waited. Felk crossed to the nurse's station. She looked tired and wrong-footed and like she was trying to locate some version of control in a situation that had removed most of her options. "Nurse Reeves," she said. "Ms. Felk. Commander Walsh has briefed me on the federal dimension of the situation." She stopped, started again. "The suspension issued this afternoon was based on a formal complaint. Under the circumstances, another stop. The review process will need to be revisited." "I understand," Lauren said. Felk looked like she wanted to say something else and couldn't find the shape of it. She turned and went to find Walsh again. Locke had not moved from where he'd stopped when the agent checked Felk's identification. He was standing near the elevator with his phone in his hand, and he was no longer making calls on it. He was reading something, and whatever he was reading was making his color go wrong. Lauren filed that and let it sit. But the talks panel came back at 10:20 p.m. Dr. Mitra came out of room 14 holding a tablet and found Lauren and handed it to her without preamble. "Tell me what you see." Lauren looked at the results. Her eyes went immediately to the lorazepam level, elevated, consistent with administration above the documented dosage. Below that, a compound she recognized from her military medical training, a specific sedative agent used in certain pre-procedural protocols that was not part of any standard civilian ICU medication list and would not have appeared in any reasonable treatment plan for this patient. He was being maintained, she said, not just sedated for medical necessity, maintained at a specific level of suppression. This, she indicated the second compound, this doesn't belong in a civilian hospital medication protocol. This is specialty access pharmacology, which means someone with access to non-standard pharmaceutical supply channels, Mitra said. Yes, Mitra took the tablet back. I'm sharing this with Walsh's team. It goes into the pre-op documentation. She looked at Lauren. The anesthesiologist has your baseline notes from this morning. We're moving to OR at 11:15. She paused. You've done everything you can do tonight, Reeves. Let us take it from here. It was said without condescension, just fact, the way Mitra seemed to say everything, clear and without unnecessary weight. Lauren nodded. Mitra went back into the room. A few minutes later, the pre-op preparation began in earnest. The quiet, organized choreography of moving a critical patient from ICU to OR, the equipment being checked, the team positions confirmed, Claire Morrow standing at the edge of it all with her hands clasped in front of her, watching her husband's face. Lauren stayed out of it. She had no role in this part. At 11:05, just before the transport team moved Sergeant Morrow toward the OR corridor, Claire Morrow broke away from the edge of the room and crossed the hallway to where Lauren was standing. She was a small woman, not physically small, but contained in the way people were contained when they were holding something large inside a tight space. Her eyes were red-rimmed, but dry now. She looked at Lauren with the direct, stripped-down attention of someone who had no capacity left for anything that wasn't essential. "You're Lauren," she said. The nurse. "Yes." When he blinked, at me. Walsh told me what that meant, that he's been aware. She stopped. Her jaw worked briefly. "For 4 days. Yes. And you knew. You figured it out. This morning, yes." Claire Morrow looked at her for a moment with an expression that Lauren didn't try to interpret because it was too layered for a quick read and wasn't hers to analyze. Then she said, very quietly, "Thank you." Lauren said, "He's the one who kept signaling. He didn't stop." Claire's expression shifted. She understood what Lauren was giving her, not the diminishment of what Lauren had done, but the location of where the real credit lived. Her husband had not given up. That was the center of it. She went back to the transport team. Lauren watched them take him down the corridor, watched Claire walk alongside the gurney with her hand close to but not touching his arm, watched the OR doors open and receive them, and then stood in the empty hallway with the monitors going quiet and the room behind her open and waiting to be cleaned. And she was very tired in a way that didn't feel like it could be fixed by sleep. The night moved in the specific way hospital nights moved after a crisis. Not fast, but continuously. The building doing its work while the thing that had just happened settled into the record. Walsh's team was in and out of rooms she hadn't expected them to access. At 11:45, she saw them enter the office that the neurology department used for research administration, the one with the filing cabinets along the south wall. At 12:30, she saw a woman she hadn't seen before, older, federal-looking, carrying a hard-sided case, go into the same office and not come out. Garrett Locke left the building at some point. She didn't see him go, but she noted his absence at the nurses' station at midnight and registered it. She gave her formal statement to a federal investigator named Huang in a small conference room off the main corridor. It took 90 minutes. She was precise and sequential and did not editorialize. Huang asked good questions and wrote fast. At the end, he asked if she had any documentation beyond what she'd already submitted. "I have everything on my phone," she said. "Time-stamped." He asked for it. She handed it over and he connected it to a device that made a copy of everything relevant in 4 minutes and handed it back. "We may need you again," he said. "I'll be available." She went back to the hallway and found the chair at the nurses' station occupied by an agent she didn't know, so she stood instead. It was 1:20 a.m. Surgery would be ongoing for at least another 2 hours based on Mitra's estimated timeline. Walsh found her at 1:40. He had a cup of coffee from somewhere, the kind that came in a paper cup from a machine, not the decent coffee from the ground floor cafe, which had closed at 10. He handed it to her, and she took it because she was past caring about the quality. "Locke," he said without preamble. She looked at him. "Garrett Locke has been the hospital's liaison to the Verispan partnership for 18 months, Walsh said. "He's the one who approved the research protocol extensions. He's the one who processed Ashby's amendment requests without requiring independent review." He paused. "He's also the one who filed the paperwork that made your suspension effective immediately rather than pending review, which is not standard protocol for a first offense complaint." She absorbed that. "He wanted me out of the building before I could do more damage to the record. Before you could talk to anyone with authority outside the hospital's chain of command." Walsh held his coffee cup. "His name appears on several financial transfer documents that DOD forensic accountants flagged 3 hours ago. Not large amounts. Structured to stay under reporting thresholds. Consultation fees paid through a Verispan subsidiary. He's been bought." "That's the working interpretation." Walsh looked down the hallway. "He went home. We let him. There are people outside his house." "When?" "Morning. The DA wants the full financial picture assembled before the arrest so the charges can be filed complete." He looked at her. "Ashby is processed. He's been formally charged, attempted murder, medical fraud, obstruction of a federal investigation. His medical license was flagged for emergency suspension by the state medical board about 2 hours ago. That process moves slower than federal charges, but it's moving." Lauren drank the bad coffee. It was too hot and too bitter, and she drank it anyway. "Verispan," she said. "The bid process has been frozen. DOD contracting office issued a hold this evening pending investigation. That's public record as of midnight." He paused. "The stock dropped 14% in after-hours trading. Someone leaked the hold notice, which we didn't authorize, but we also didn't lose sleep over it." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "What happens to the research data?" she said. "The study outcomes? The patients who were enrolled?" Walsh's expression shifted slightly. "That's the part that takes longer. Independent review of every patient file associated with the protocol, determining who was correctly classified and who wasn't. Some of those cases go back 18 months. He looked at her. "That's going to need people who understand both the medical dimension and the operational one. There's going to be a process." She understood what he wasn't directly saying. "Who runs it?" she said. "That's being determined." He didn't look away from her. "Your name has come up." She held the cup in both hands and said nothing for a moment. "I'm currently suspended," she said. "Yes." He said it without irony. "That situation is also being determined." Well, Dr. Mitra came out of the OR at 3:48 a.m. Lauren had moved to the surgical waiting area at some point. She couldn't precisely account for when, and was in one of the chairs when the doors opened and Mitra walked through in scrubs, her cap still on, pulling her gloves off with the practiced efficiency of someone at the end of a long procedure. Claire Morrow stood up from the chair across the room. "Decompression was successful," Mitra said. She said it directly to Claire, and then she kept going because Claire needed more than 2 words. The compression at C4 to C5 was significant, and it had been building for longer than the admission date, probably a pre-existing vulnerability that the trauma event pushed into active compression. "We relieved it completely. There was no additional vascular compromise." She paused. "His neurological baseline going into surgery was better than I expected given the tox screen results. The sedation load he'd been carrying was substantial, but his system had been managing it. That's a good indicator." She paused again. "He's going to need time, rehabilitation. The spinal cord doesn't snap back immediately just because the compression is gone. But the injury is addressed. He's out of immediate danger." Claire put her hand over her mouth. She kept it there for a few seconds. Then she lowered it and asked, very steadily, "When can I see him?" "Recovery room, 30 minutes. Mitra looked at her with the direct but not unkind regard of someone who had delivered enough of these that she understood exactly what they cost to receive. "He's going to be sedated for recovery. Medical sedation. Appropriately dosed. Nothing like what he's been carrying. He won't be interactive tonight, but he'll be there." Claire nodded. "That's enough," she said. "That's enough for tonight." Mitra turned to Lauren. She looked at her for a moment with the considering expression Lauren had seen earlier. The filing information look. "Good catch this morning," she said. "The hand grip variants. Most nurses would have logged it and moved on." "I almost did," Lauren said. It was true. She had almost moved on. She had sat in the chair for another 10 minutes after she logged it, telling herself she was overreading before the signal in his eye had made it impossible to pretend. Mitra nodded once and went to find her residence. Lauren sat back down in the waiting area chair. The room was quiet. Just her and Claire was looking at the OR doors with the focused waiting attention of someone counting down 30 minutes with their whole body. The building hummed around them. Climate control, elevator machinery, the distant sound of equipment on other floors. The ordinary infrastructure of a place built for crisis, doing its work through the night. At 4:22 a.m., Walsh came into the waiting room. He had his phone in his hand and he looked at Lauren with the expression of someone who needed to say something that hadn't been in the plan. "What?" she said. "Locke," he said. He stopped, started again. "He's not at his residence." She sat up straighter. "His car is in the driveway. His phone is inside the house. We're tracking the signal. The agents outside didn't see him leave, but he's not there." Walsh's face was doing the controlled thing it did when a situation was developing in a direction that required recalibration. "We're treating it as a flight risk situation, which means the timeline moves up." "He was in the building tonight," Lauren said. "Until midnight. He was standing at the elevator and reading something on his phone. He left before I gave my statement." "We know. He could have taken something with him. We're assessing what was accessible to him." Walsh looked at her. "The Research Administration office. You said you saw investigators go in there at 11:45. "Yes, but Locke left before that." Walsh was on the phone before she finished the sentence, moving back toward the hallway. Lauren stood up. She thought about the Research Administration office, the filing cabinets along the south wall, the specific way Locke had been standing near the elevator at midnight, not leaving, not staying, just standing with his phone, reading, and the sudden absence she'd noticed when she looked for him later. She thought about what was in those files, not just Ashby's research data, the patient enrollment records, the consent documentation, the financial amendment approvals with Locke's signature on them. She thought about what those documents would be worth to someone facing federal charges if they disappeared before the investigators finished photographing them. She went into the hallway. Walsh was 20 feet ahead of her, still on the phone. She was about to follow him when she almost walked directly into a woman coming around the corner from the administrative corridor. The older woman with the hard-sided case, the one who had gone into the research office at 12:30 and hadn't come out when Lauren was watching. The woman stopped, looked at Lauren, then she looked at Walsh. "Commander," she called. Walsh turned. "The Verispan patient files," the woman said. She said it in the measured tone of someone delivering information that needed to land cleanly. "The physical originals, the filing cabinet they were in." She paused. "It's empty." The hallway held that for a moment. Walsh lowered his phone. He looked at Lauren. Lauren looked at him. "He didn't run," Lauren said. Walsh understood it in the same second she did. "He's still in the building," he said. Walsh moved first, pulling two agents from the hallway with a hand signal that didn't require explanation. Lauren was already thinking through the building layout, the administrative corridor, the research office, the exits accessible from that wing without passing through the main nursing station or the atrium. "Service stairs on the west side," she said. "The research office has a connecting door to the administrative annex. The annex has a loading access on the ground floor that doesn't run through the main security desk." Walsh looked at her. "You know this building." "I've worked here 14 months. He made a decision in about 2 seconds. "Come with me. Stay behind the team." They moved fast and quiet. The way people moved when running was the wrong choice, but walking wasn't either. The controlled, purposeful pace that covered ground without announcing itself. The administrative corridor at 4 a.m. was empty. The overhead lights on their night reduction setting, everything slightly dimmer and more honest looking than it was during the day. The research administration office door was open. The investigators had left it that way. Walsh went in first with an agent at his shoulder. Lauren came through behind them and took in the room in the first 3 seconds. Filing cabinets along the south wall, 3 of them, 2 with their drawers hanging open and empty, the third closed. A desk with a computer. A second door on the far wall, the connecting door to the annex, standing 4 inches open with the specific quality of a door that had been moved through recently and not fully latched on the way through. An agent went to the connecting door and pushed it open and went through. Walsh was right behind him. Lauren looked at the open filing cabinets, at the empty drawers. She thought about what Locke had been doing standing at the elevator at midnight, not leaving, not staying, waiting. Waiting for the investigators to establish their presence in the building so he could see exactly which rooms they were working and what their pattern was. Learning the gaps. He'd had 2 hours. She went through the connecting door. The administrative annex was a narrower space, a corridor lined with secondary offices, storage rooms, the kind of institutional back-of-house space that existed in every large building and was invisible to anyone who didn't need it. At the far end, the loading access, a heavy fire door with a push bar, currently held open by a rubber wedge. Through the open door came the cold October air and the dark of the pre-dawn service area, and in that dark was the sound of movement, not running, something more effortful, the specific sound of a person carrying something heavy trying to move faster than the weight allowed. The 2 agents went through the door. Walsh followed. Lauren followed Walsh. The service area behind Hargrove General was a concrete apron between the building's rear face and a chain-link fence, wide enough for delivery vehicles, lit by 3 overhead security lights, 2 of which were working. Garrett Locke was 20 yards out, moving toward the fence's access gate with a document box under each arm. He was 61 years old, and he was not built for this, and the boxes were slowing him badly. "Locke," one of the agents called. "Stop!" He didn't stop. He made it 4 more steps before the agent covered the ground between them, and then it was over. The agent had him by the collar of his jacket before the second agent reached them, and Locke stumbled and went to one knee, and the boxes hit the concrete, and the contents of the one on top came open and document pages scattered in the cold wind coming off the mountains to the west, white against the dark pavement. Lauren stopped at the edge of the concrete apron. She watched the agents work. She watched Locke, on one knee with his hands being secured behind him, look at the scattered documents blowing toward the fence with an expression that was past calculation now, past the carefully managed face he'd maintained in the hospital building, and was just the raw look of a man watching the specific thing he'd tried to protect get out of his reach anyway. Walsh stood beside her for a moment. $400 million contract, he said quietly. He was going to get 2% of Verispan's net gain, contingency fee, buried in the subsidiary structure. He paused. $8 million. For keeping a man trapped in his own body, Lauren said. Walsh didn't respond to that. There wasn't anything to say to it. Two other agents were collecting the scattered documents from the ground, weighting pages with stones and hands against the wind, working in the ugly yellow light of the functioning security lamps. Locke was on his feet now, hands secured, and the agent with him was talking in the low, formal cadence of a rights advisement. Locke looked across the concrete at Lauren. She met his gaze. She didn't say anything and didn't move, and after a moment he looked away, not because she'd done anything to make him, but because there was nothing left to look for in her direction. The agents walked him back toward the building. The document pages were being gathered and boxed. The cold air continued its business. Lauren stood in the service area until the last agent had gone back inside, and then she stood there a little longer because the cold felt necessary somehow. Clarifying, the way cold was when you'd been in institutional air for too long. The sky to the east was still fully dark, but there was the first suggestion of something on the horizon, the color change that happened before you could call it light. She was tired all the way down, the kind of tired that didn't have a quick fix. She went back inside. Dawn came without fanfare. By 6 a.m., Hargrove General was beginning its ordinary morning, the shift change, the breakfast trays, the particular institutional optimism of a new day cycle starting. The federal presence was still in the building, but had consolidated into specific rooms, their work visible only in the occasional agent in the hallway and the sealed research office and the security log on room 14 that now had a federal notation beside the hospital one. Sergeant Morrow was in recovery, stable. Mitra's team was monitoring him through the morning. Lauren was in the surgical waiting room when Patricia Holloway found her at 6:15. Patricia sat down in the chair beside her and looked at her with the particular expression of someone who had been on shift for too long and was running on professional momentum. Sandra Felk wants to meet with you this morning, Patricia said. 9 o'clock. I know. She's also asked me to tell you, Patricia paused, picking her words with visible care, that the administrative suspension is being held in abeyance pending review, which is the legal way of saying she's not sure it was warranted and she's not going to enforce it while the situation is what it is. What it is? Lauren said. What it is, Patricia agreed. She looked at the floor. Ashby supervised this floor for 6 years. I worked with him for 6 years. I didn't... She stopped. You couldn't have known, Lauren said. I missed things. So did I, before yesterday morning. He was careful about what he showed. Lauren turned to look at her directly. The patients he enrolled in the protocol, the ones he classified incorrectly. We're going to need to go back through those files and figure out who they were and what they actually needed. That's going to require nurses who knew this floor. That's going to require you. Patricia was quiet for a moment. How many? I don't know yet. Walsh's team is working on it. If it goes back 18 months, Patricia started and didn't finish. Yeah, Lauren said. They sat with that. The 9 o'clock meeting with Sandra Felk lasted 40 minutes and covered ground that was uncomfortable for everyone in the room, which meant it was an honest meeting, which was more than Lauren had expected. Walsh was there. An attorney from the DOD's legal office was there. Patricia Holloway was there. Garrett Locke's chair at the table was empty, and no one mentioned it, and no one needed to. Felk had the look of someone who had not slept and had been doing the kind of administrative reckoning that came from realizing the institution you ran had been used as an instrument of harm by people you had trusted and promoted and defended. It was not a comfortable look. Lauren didn't try to make it more comfortable. The suspension was formally rescinded. The language Felk used was careful, pending the outcome of the ongoing federal review. The complaint filed by Dr. Ashby is being considered withdrawn in light of the complainant's arrest and the related circumstances. But the substance was clear. Lauren's employment status was restored effective immediately. She accepted it without theatrics. The DOD attorney, a woman named Briggs, methodical and precise, outlined the review process for the research protocol cases. Every patient file from the Verispan study needed independent assessment. The hospital's legal exposure was significant. The path forward involved cooperation with federal investigators, independent clinical review, and likely years of follow-on litigation. We'll need clinical staff with neurology floor experience to support the file review, Briggs said. People who understand both the documentation protocols and the practical realities of patient assessment on this specific unit. Reeves, Patricia said immediately. Not even a pause. Briggs looked at Lauren. Is that something you'd be willing to consider in addition to your regular duties? Lauren thought about the filing cabinets and the empty drawers. She thought about 18 months of patience. She thought about a man blinking SOS in a dim hospital room. Yes, she said. She went to see him at 11. The recovery room had been cleared to a private space, Walsh's doing, for security and for Claire. And when Lauren came to the door, Claire was inside, sitting in the chair beside the bed with a cup of cold coffee and her phone in her lap. She looked up when Lauren appeared in the doorway and waved her in without speaking. Sergeant Morrow was off the ventilator. That was the first thing Lauren registered, and it was a significant thing. Mitra had extubated him during recovery, which meant he was breathing on his own, which meant the decompression had done what it needed to do at the neurological level. He was still deeply sedated from the surgical protocol, eyes closed, face slack in the particular way of medical unconsciousness rather than injury, which was a completely different quality that Lauren recognized with the part of her that had been watching patients for years. She stood at the foot of the bed for a moment. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him the first night. Not at the obvious data, but at the spaces between it. He was there. That was the whole of it, really. He was there. Claire was watching her. He squeezed my hand an hour ago, she said. Mitra said that's a good sign. Real movement. It is, Lauren said. She said it could be weeks before we know the full picture. The rehabilitation timeline. Yes. She said. Claire stopped. She set the cold coffee on the table beside her. She said that if the compression had gone another 48 to 72 hours without surgical intervention, the probability of meaningful recovery dropped significantly. She didn't look at Lauren when she said this. She was looking at her husband's face. She said we were on the edge of that window. Lauren didn't say anything. I need to say thank you, Claire said. Properly. Not the way I said it last night when I was... She made a brief gesture that encompassed all of what last night had been. Not like that. I need you to actually hear it. I heard it last night. Lauren. Claire looked at her then. Her voice was steady in the way that things were steady when they had been through something and come out the other side still intact, not unbroken, but intact. He would be dead. Or, she paused, or he would be in a long-term care facility being classified as permanently vegetative, and I would be signing papers. In a week, maybe 2, I would be making decisions about removing support. She held Lauren's gaze. And I would never have known he was in there. The room was quiet except for the monitors. Lauren said, He's the one who kept the light on. I just knew how to look for it. Claire held her gaze for a moment longer. Then she nodded once in the way of someone accepting a truth, while also knowing it wasn't the whole truth, and turned back to watch her husband breathe. 3 weeks later, he spoke. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a cinematic moment with sunlight and tears and a room full of witnesses. It was 7:40 in the morning, and Lauren was doing her regular rounds, and she pushed open the door of what was now simply room 14 again. The security log long since removed, the federal notation gone, just a room with a patient in it, and Sergeant Daniel Morrow was awake, propped at a slight incline, and when she came in, he turned his head to look at her. His right hand was resting on the bed rail. He lifted 2 fingers in a small, deliberate gesture that was not quite a wave. She stopped in the doorway. Hey, he said. His voice was rough from weeks of disuse and the ventilator and everything that had happened to his throat. One word, completely unmistakable. Lauren stood in the doorway of room 14 at 7:40 in the morning with her chart in her hand, and she felt something move through her that she couldn't have named cleanly and didn't try to. The thing that happened when you had carried something for a long time and the carrying was over and the weight didn't disappear all at once, it just redistributed, became something different, something you could put down for a moment and look at. Hey, she said back. He looked at her with clear and present eyes, not the single right eye of a man fighting to use what little he had. Both eyes, direct and brown, and belonging to a person who was entirely in the room. Spectre, he said, rough and quiet and deliberate. She crossed to his bedside. She sat in the chair. She looked at him. "Easy, Ranger," she said. He almost smiled. His face was still rebuilding the fluency for it, the muscle control coming back in stages. But the shape of it was there. "You answered," he said. "Yes." And there. He stopped, swallowed, the effort of more than a few words still real. "I wasn't sure. Wasn't sure you were real." "I know." Kept thinking. Another pause. "Might be dreaming it." "You weren't," she said. "I was there." He was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, Denfield was doing what it did in the late October mornings. Gray sky, the mountains present at the edge of visibility, the town moving in its ordinary way below. She had started to love this town when she moved here, and then spent a year in it watching the love become something quieter and more complicated. And sitting here now, she wasn't sure what to call what she felt about it. Home, maybe. The word was fraught, and she was still working on it. "Walsh told me," Morrow said, "about what you did." "Walsh talks too much." He made the almost smile again. "He said you came back after the suspension." He looked at her directly. "That you stayed in the room." She didn't deny it, didn't explain it. Some things were the shape they were. "You would have done the same," she said. He thought about that. "Yeah," he said, "but I didn't have to." She sat with him for 20 minutes. They didn't talk the whole time. He tired quickly still, the energy for language running out and rebuilding in short cycles. But the silence between talking was easy. The silence of people who had known each other in conditions that forged a specific kind of understanding, one that didn't require constant maintenance. When his eyes started going heavy, she stood up. "Sleep," she said. He was almost there already. "Tomorrow," he said, half into the pillow. "Rehab starts." "I know. Mitra's team has a whole plan." "You'll be here?" She picked up her chart. She looked at him, at the whole of him, the person who was there, where for 5 days there had seemed to be nothing, the man who had blinked SOS with one eye and held on to the word for whoever might know how to receive it. "I'll be here," she said. She went back to her rounds. The months that followed were not neat. They were the way real things were, forward and back, with setbacks and adjustments and days that were harder than expected. Sergeant Morrow's rehabilitation was not a straight line. Some mornings the movement was there and some mornings it wasn't, and the physical therapists were honest about what that meant and what it didn't mean, and Claire drove back and forth from their home state 4 times before making the decision to work remotely from a short-term rental in Denfield, and that decision had its own costs and adjustments. Ashby's trial date was set. Locke was charged separately, but the cases were connected, and the federal process moved at the pace federal processes moved, which was not satisfying in its speed, but was, eventually, thorough. The charges were serious and specific: attempted murder, medical fraud, conspiracy to obstruct a federal contracting process, illegal pharmaceutical administration. Verispan Neurotech's bid was formally disqualified. The company's stock lost 61% of its value over the following 6 weeks. 3 of its executives resigned. 2 were subsequently charged. The independent review of the research protocol cases identified 9 patients over 18 months whose neurological classifications were inconsistent with their actual presentation. Not all of them were as recoverable as Morrow. Some had genuine injuries that Ashby had not manufactured, only misrepresented. But 4 of them were transferred to active rehabilitation programs they had not been receiving. 2 showed significant improvement within the first 60 days. Lauren participated in every review. She read every file. She sat in meetings with federal attorneys and hospital administrators, an independent neurologist flown in from 2 different cities, and she said what she saw and documented what she knew and did not let the process become abstract in the way institutional processes wanted to become abstract. She kept the names attached to the cases. She made sure everyone in those rooms remembered that the files were people. It was slow and it was often frustrating, and it was the most useful thing she had done in years. Sandra Felk did not rebuild overnight into someone Lauren trusted. That was too much to expect from too short a time, but she was trying. genuinely trying, which was different from performing contrition, and she made structural changes that had teeth: a new independent clinical review board for research protocols, mandatory second opinion requirements for any catastrophic neurological classification, a direct reporting line for nursing staff that bypassed department heads for patient safety concerns. They weren't enough on their own. They were the beginning of something that might become enough if the people maintaining them held to it. Patricia Holloway was named to chair the clinical review board. She accepted the position with the specific expression of someone taking on a weight they weren't sure they could carry, but were going to carry anyway. Walsh came back to Denfield once, in January. He came into the hospital on a Tuesday morning and found Lauren at the nurses' station and handed her an envelope without a lot of preamble. Inside was a letter from Naval Special Warfare Command on official letterhead, recognizing her contribution to the investigation and the preservation of Sergeant Morrow's life, signed by people whose signatures carried institutional weight. She read it. She folded it. She put it back in the envelope. "It'll be in your record," Walsh said. "Okay." "There's also—" He paused in the particular way he paused when he was about to say something he wasn't entirely comfortable saying. "A formal commendation request. From Morrow. He submitted it independently. That's a different document." She held the envelope. "I'm a civilian." The commendation process accommodates civilian contributors in operational contexts. He looked at her. "You don't have to accept it." She thought about that. About what it meant to accept something like that, and what it meant to not accept it, and which of those was the truer response to what had actually happened. "I'll think about it," she said. Walsh nodded. He looked down the hallway toward room 14, which currently held a different patient. Morrow had been moved to a rehabilitation facility 2 weeks earlier, the next phase of the long work his recovery required. "He's doing well," Walsh said, "in case you hadn't heard." "I heard." "He asked me to tell you." Walsh stopped. He seemed to be deciding how to render something that had been said in a register he wasn't fully comfortable conveying. "He said he thinks about the chair." She looked at him. "The chair?" "The chair you put next to his bed. The first night. He said he remembers hearing it scrape when you sat down. Said he'd been—" Walsh paused again. "Said he'd been in the dark for a long time, and when he heard that, he thought maybe it wasn't going to be dark forever." Lauren stood at the nurses' station in Hargrove General with the envelope in her hand and the ordinary morning of the hospital floor moving around her, and she held that for a moment. A chair scraping. The most unremarkable sound in the world. "Tell him I'll stop by when he's ready for visitors," she said. Walsh said he would. He left the way he'd come in, child. Practical and without fanfare. Just a man who had a lot of other things to do and had taken the time to do this one. Lauren put the envelope in her locker and went back to work. On a Wednesday morning in March, 6 months and some days after a Tuesday night, when everything in her carefully constructed quiet life had broken open at the seams, Lauren Reeves pushed open the door to a room at the Clearfield Rehabilitation Center on the south end of Denfield and found Sergeant Daniel Morrow standing. Actually standing, both feet on the floor, both hands on the parallel bars, upright. Not without effort, not without the specific fierce concentration of a man requiring every available internal resource for a thing that used to be automatic, but upright. She stopped in the doorway. He looked up and saw her, and the concentration didn't break, but something in his face shifted. "You're early," he said. "You said 11. "It is 11. He looked back at the far end of the bars. "Come in, or don't. I'm in the middle of something." She came in. She sat in a chair against the wall and she watched him work the length of the parallel bars. 12 feet maybe, and it cost him, the left leg still not fully answering when he needed it to, the grip on the bars tighter than it should need to be, the sweat on his forehead legitimate effort. Sweat not performance. And when he reached the end, he stopped and stood and breathed, and she saw him put his head down for a moment. His physical therapist, a young man named Garrett, who Lauren had met twice before, made a quiet note on his clipboard and didn't say anything, which was the right call. Then Morrow looked up. 11 feet, he said. 12, Lauren said. 12. He turned himself around, the movement careful and deliberate. 6 months ago, I was blinking the alphabet with one eye. 3 letters, she said. SOS. 3 letters, he agreed. He made his way back. Slower on the return, the left leg heavier. He made it. He stood at the starting end of the bars and held them and looked at her with the direct, clear-eyed gaze that had replaced the single-eye signal and still carried something of the same quality. The particular attention of someone who has learned to use exactly what they have and waste nothing. Garrett says maybe a cane by summer, he said. If the left side catches up. It will, she said. You don't know that. No, she admitted, but I know what it took to get here. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Walsh called me about the commendation. I know. You haven't given him an answer. Not yet. He looked at her steadily. Lauren. He said her name in the flat, practical way he said most things. No ornamentation. Take the commendation. I'm thinking about it. You saved my life. You can accept a piece of paper about it. I came back to a building I'd been suspended from and stayed in your room without authorization and removed evidence from your IV line and chased your doctor into a stairwell, she said. I'm not sure all of that falls under what commendations are designed to recognize. He almost smiled. The face was fully conversant with it now, the expression clear and complete. It falls under what I'm designed to recognize, he said. She looked at him, at the parallel bars and the grip and the 12 feet of ground he'd covered, and the 12 feet of ground he was going to cover again tomorrow, and the day after, and all the distances that word meant in all its forms. Okay, she said. Okay, you'll take it? Okay, I'll think about it more seriously. He shook his head slightly. You're the most stubborn person I've ever met. You work in special operations, she said. That's a significant claim. Still stands. She stood up. She had a shift starting at noon and the drive back to the hospital was 20 minutes, and she still needed to stop and eat something because she had learned, imperfectly and still inconsistently, to try and actually eat before long shifts. Same time Thursday? She said. I'll be here. She picked up her bag. She stopped at the door and looked back at him, standing at the start of the bars, both feet on the floor, the left leg unsteady but present, the whole of him upright in the morning light coming through the rehabilitation center's wide windows. 12 feet today, she said. Yeah, he said. She went out into the March morning and drove back toward Hargrove General and the day that was waiting there. The mountains were still snow-capped on the western horizon, and the town was fully awake now, moving in its ordinary patterns, and she drove through it, thinking about what it meant to have a life that had broken open and what you did with the pieces when the breaking was done. She thought about a chair scraping on a hospital floor at 4 a.m, about a single eye blinking in a pattern that nobody should have recognized, about sitting down and saying, I see you to someone in a room full of people who had already decided he wasn't there. She had almost kept walking that morning. She had almost let the institutional momentum carry her past that room, past that chart, past the detail that didn't fit. She had almost talked herself out of what she was seeing because the architecture of the place she worked in was designed to redirect her, and because she was tired and because the person in that bed had already been assessed by people with more credentials and more authority and more visibility than she had. She hadn't kept walking. Not because she was exceptional, not because she had some extraordinary courage gene that other people lacked, but because she had trained herself, across years and in conditions she didn't talk about at work, to trust the specific discomfort of a thing that didn't fit, to sit with it instead of explaining it away, to stay in the room instead of moving on to the easier task. That was the whole of it. That was the thing that had looked like heroism from the outside but felt, from the inside, like just not being able to leave. You couldn't always fix the institution. You couldn't always outmaneuver the person above you in the hierarchy. You couldn't always make the room believe you before the damage was done. But you could stay. You could document. You could look at the thing everyone else was looking past and keep looking at it. And you could trust that what you saw was real, even when the room was full of people telling you it wasn't. You could pull a chair to a bedside at 4 a.m. and let a person in the dark know that someone was there. That was not a small thing. It had never been a small thing. The people who got to decide what was small and what wasn't had gotten that wrong for a very long time, and Lauren Reeves was not going to spend the rest of her working life waiting for them to get it right on their own. She pulled into the hospital parking structure. She found her space. She turned off the engine and sat for a moment in the particular morning quiet of a car after a drive, And then she picked up her bag and got out and walked toward the building that had suspended her and reinstated her, and where someone was going to need something today that she was equipped to give them. The doors opened when she reached them, the automatic slide of institutional welcome, and she went in and she went to work. Months later, when people asked Lauren Reeves what had happened at Hargrove General, and people asked, because the federal case had public dimensions that made the question unavoidable, she gave them the short version. A patient was being harmed. She recognized it. She stayed until it stopped. Most people wanted more than that. They wanted the part about the classified call signs and the federal agents and the stairwell, the parts that had texture and drama, the parts that explained why it made the news. She gave them those parts too, when asked, because they were true and they mattered. But the part she returned to, the part she found herself saying to the nursing students who rotated through Hargrove's neurology floor in the program that was established after everything settled, was quieter than any of that. You will work in places that are wrong sometimes, she told them. The institution will be wrong. The senior physician will be wrong. The chart will say one thing and the patient will be telling you another, and nobody in the room will be listening to the patient because the patient has already been classified, and the classification determines what's worth noticing. She looked at them. Young, trained, ready, not yet tested. Your job is to look at the patient, not the chart, not the classification, not the hierarchy of who signed what. The patient. Whatever they have left to communicate with. A word, a look, a hand that's tighter on one side than the other. That's the data. That's what you're there for. And if the room tells you that you're wrong, she said, and you have looked carefully and you know what you saw, stay in the room. Just stay in the room. They wrote it down. She didn't tell them it was easy. She didn't tell them the institution would thank them for it, or that the people above them would see clearly when they needed to be seen, or that doing the right thing came without cost. She had paid costs. She would pay more. But she was still in the room. That was what she had. That was what she was. And on a Wednesday in March, in a rehabilitation center on the south end of Denfield, Colorado, a man who had been declared absent by every official measure had stood on his own 2 feet and walked 12 feet down a pair of parallel bars. And the person who had sat in a chair next to his bed at 4 a.m. and refused to leave had been there to see it. That was enough. That had always been enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.